Yeah, hello again. This is week two. Now I'm going to take you through chapter three. Chapter three is about survey and sampling, and it's very important to understand when it comes to data. And before we make any kind of analysis, we need to make sure that our data being collected in a proper way. So then survey and sampling became very important subjects. You have to pay attention to multiple principles, multiple issues when it comes to designing a survey. So this is a very important topic. If I may say that all companies, they always have a struggle to collect proper data. Most of the companies definitely they have their own ERP systems like CRM as well, where they can collect data about their activities, whether business activities externally or internally through customer behavior or maybe even employees behavior and so on. So this kind of data are there and it's very important, but it can also be used in order to design product, design service, improve performance, cutting costs, making processes more efficient. But sometimes this kind of data that coming from technology are not enough for some purposes. So when it comes sometimes to understanding customer behavior or whether you are talking about B2B or B2C, then it became very essential to not only rely on the internal technologies being used, but also to design your own survey. So one of the very important principles when it comes to sampling and survey is to make sure that the sample that we are taking from the population has to be unbiased, or in another word, we call it representative sample. One of the important actions or ways to remedy this kind of bias, because we are afraid that we get our data only from a specific angle of our population, not everyone is being represented, then became very biased in this case. So in order to go around this biasness, the random sampling became very essential. Randomization, it's very important. So for that reason, you need always to make sure when it comes to sampling is we go through random sampling. Nevertheless, you can understand when we change the samples, the result will be different. So we expect some kind of variability in results when we change the samples that we are taking from the population. We will not get the exact result, but we always get similar results. This is if the instrument or the data collection instrument, in this case the survey, is reliable. Sample size is definitely very important, but you have to pay attention that too much of a sample is not good, too little as well is not good. So there are a lot of methodologies and tools and scientific methods to identify the right size of the sample. Census is another topic. You need to understand this topic. Usually, census is the closest, let us say, the closest sample to the population, where it's very close to the population, but it's being used not always in the business settings. Usually, being used on national level when they go every now and then, every 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, to run a census about the household behavior, which allows the nation or the government to set new rules, new laws, new policy, improve lifestyle for its own people. So census is very, very important. The only problem is it's too big and you cannot wait. For business, you can't wait until you get the census of your population, because it's you will be very slow. You will not take action in the market, and when it comes to business, you have to take very quick actions based on whatever you have in terms of data. But when it comes to government can allow maybe 6 months until they collect their data, and they have their own time, and after that they can make their decisions. But when it comes to business, the business pace and the market will not wait for that. So census is not really practical when it comes to business. So we come to another important topic, which called the when it comes to try to make a link between population and sample. It's basically the sample is part of the population, hopefully. And since the population, we know that the population will or actually includes all main characteristics, and we as a business professionals, we like very much to definitely reach the population in order to make the best or develop the best product, or design the best product or service for our customer. But as I mentioned before, if the population is really large, you cannot wait until you ask every person in the population. For that reason, we come up with the sample. So, but sample has also characteristics like the population. So you have to pay attention to the difference between population difference in terms of parameters. So the characteristic of any population, we call them parameter, like the average or the mean, median, mode, standard deviation, or variance, or correlation. This is what we call them parameters. But since we are not going to access all population, then we make decisions on what we have in hand, and usually we will have a sample, and the characteristic of the sample, we call them statistics. So statistics are estimation of the parameters, and they are not the true parameter. They are just some kind of facts that hopefully they are close to the parameters. So once again, population parameters are the characteristics of the population, but sample statistics are the characteristic of the samples. And our hope is always to make sure that when we collect samples and we analyze our data, we come across the statistics like average of the sample or the median of the sample. Hopefully, we always hope that this kind of statistic will be as close as possible to the parameters. And be careful, because parameter, we don't know them. They will always be hidden. We will never know them. Just we speculate when it comes to sample, because if we know the parameters, you can imagine we don't need the idea of statistics at all. So we hope always to have a representative sample, as you can see here. But representative sample has also some conditions. One of them is, we talked about it, to have an unbiased samples, the sample size to be carefully identified, and to get and select the participant in the sample to be randomly selected. And this is why it's a simple random sample is very important. It's the fundamental aspect when it comes to data collection, as well as data analysis. So simple random sample became very important aspect. Unfortunately, not every time we'll be able to come to get our sample based on simple random sampling, because sometimes our population consists of different strata, or different distributions, or different ingredients and structures. So you cannot really take random sample without paying attention to the strata or the cluster of the sample itself. Sampling frame is nothing but a list of all respondents from which we're gonna get our sample. For instance, imagine that if we want to go through research about how students at Algoma University perceive the online experience when it comes to learning, then you might really go ahead and say, okay, we need to design survey, and when we select our people or respondent, we hope the respondent will be from definitely Algoma University. So, but you want also to select them randomly, and only the student who happen to go through online learning, and not every student. So you're going to ask the registrar to give you a list of all students who attended last semester the courses through online, and the list of all students will be considered as a sampling frame. So maybe we will be given maybe 2,000-3,000 students, but we cannot really ask that these 2,000 students, so we want to maybe select 100 or 200 students only. So based on this sampling frame, we're going to select 200 students in a random way as well. We talked about sampling variability, and that means the result will change from sample to sample. So that's why it's very important to test this aspect as well. When it comes to random sampling, as I mentioned before, sometimes we will not be able to go through the simple random sampling as we wanted. For that reason, we need to go through some other well-known sampling criteria. As you can see in front of you, that we have 4 ways. Of course, there are more and more, but maybe in this class, we just go through this main sampling criteria, or we call them sampling methods. The first one is called stratified, and then clustered and systematic, and then multi-stage. Let us take one by one. Stratified sampling, it's a kind of slice the population into homogeneous group. We call them strata. So for instance, a homogeneous group, like maybe you want to slice or segment the population according to a certain gender, or certain age group, or according to certain nation. So the group of students coming from one nation, we call them homogeneous or strata. And if you want really to make sure that we are asking fair, or we have a representative sample, then every nation that is in population of the student at Algoma should be represented in our sample. So we have to make sure that each nation be represented. So we call it here stratified sampling. Sometimes if we are not concerned about the strata or this homogeneous groups, we might go to different ways, like split the population into parts or cluster, with each representing the wide variety of individuals. Like maybe a cluster could be a cluster like Brampton campus. You want to compare it to Sault Ste. Marie campus against the Timmins campus. So that's called, in this case, cluster. Systematic, it's very even the simplest one. You might have, if you remember when I talked about the sampling frame, from which you might really start with, because the sample frame, when you get the student, you probably will get the list order or sorted by name, or by last name, or the first name in alphabetical order. So you want really to make sure that you get this 200 students from this sampling frame in a random way, but in a systematic way as well. So you might really start by number 5, or even number 6, or even number 10, and you might say, okay, every 10 student, I will take one student to send the student an email to answer this survey. Whether you want really to select every 10 or every 20 or every 15, that is totally up to you. The only way is you need to make sure that you are getting the 100 and 200 enough when you go with this. So if you have an already 1,000 students, and you want 200, then you have to really divide this 2,000 students by this number, by 200, in order to say, okay, every 10 students I might really need to get one. So it's really simple. It's systematic. It means it's constant, but you can start randomly by any one, and then you fix the number of jump from one student to another. Multi-stage is very simple. Is actually applying multiple methods in order to get your data. It's not about I like or dislike this method. It's about whether or not this method is relevant to the subject or the purpose of my data collection and analysis. Yeah, this is, maybe I will go through some of them. You can hear a couple of guidelines for how to make sure that your questionnaire is valid. So for that reason, validity of the survey became very essential and very hot topic when it comes to sampling. So you have to pay attention to how can we guarantee and ensure that our survey is valid. So we come to this term of validity. So validity means we are measuring what we are intending to measure and not measuring anything else. So definitely to ensure this validity, we have to be following certain guidelines, like you make sure that you get the sample size in an optimal manner. You select your sampling with the right sampling methods and bringing them from the right sampling frame. So everything we talked about it before these slides, if you make sure that you have them all, you will be definitely sure that you have valid survey. There are some other concepts you need to pay attention to it. One of them is called non-response bias and voluntary response bias. Non-response bias, it's, as you can see, it's the people who didn't respond to our survey for some reason. Maybe they didn't see our survey, or maybe we didn't send them to them, or maybe they knew that the survey is there but they didn't want to participate. So sometimes not having their voice, and their voice could be really very important, but by not having them, it might really affect our result, and we only reflect the voice of people who respond to our survey, which could be also another way of bias. There is another bias, that there are a lot of people who are very interested to respond to any questionnaire, to any survey, just to be there, and sometimes they really put more bias in our data, because they always like to go and even if they don't, if you don't really invite them, they come to your survey to see it and say, okay, let me do it. Yeah, but yeah, this will influence the results. So you have two different types here. So pay attention to the difference, and it's very important when we design survey to be valid, is always to manage the bias, to try to remedy every bias in our data collection, and those are just type of them. This, it's a very nice visualization to show you the difference between accuracy and biasness or unbiasedness of a certain measurement. So if you can look at the left hand side here on the top left, you see that most of the points, it's like you have a dart and you have the red point in the middle is your target, and this is what we want to measure, and these little things, it's our samples. So it looks like we are measuring what we intended to measure. So this is very accurate, and it's unbiased because there is no directional or very biased direction of the points. It's very clear they are scattered in a way, there is no pattern, so that it's an indication of unbiasedness. So this is the best way in order to design your survey, to make sure that the survey is really in this case valid. Of course, you can look very quick to the other dart visualization here. You will see immediately the difference between accuracy and inaccurate, bias and unbiased. So definitely the left top corner is our aim when we design a research or survey. So also some biasness could happen if we are really using very bold leading wordings that really affect the answer and the response of our respondent and the participants. So we need to be very careful when we phrase our questions. We need to be indifferent, not to push in one direction. So sometimes the surveyors, they like to hear some scores in their favor, so they really ask questions to push the respondent without knowing, or to manipulate their ways to respond to our questionnaire, so they really influence the result. Measurement errors, it's always very important, in order, because for every measurement we will always have error, because we are definitely not going to have a perfect measurement. There will be always error in measurements, as you can see from the previous slides. But in order to, when you design any survey, it's very advised that you need to go to pilot test in order to make sure that you are measuring what you intend to measure. This is an example. I want you guys to look at it. I will not really discuss it here. It shows you the difference between representative sample and not representative samples. Try to read it and you will see it's a self-explanatory here. So in order to get used to what do we mean by representative sample. There are different types of sampling. We discussed that. There are some convenience sampling because not every time we'll be able to get random samples. Sometimes we might really be under pressure of time, so we'll say, okay, I cannot wait until everyone from the whole university will answer my questionnaire, so I will rely only on my colleagues in my classroom. So, and then that is very convenient. It's very dangerous because it also formulates kind of bias, but sometimes in data collection and analysis, there is no other way out. So try really not always to use it, but you might really use it if you have to. But in meanwhile, you need to really make sure that this was the last resort that you can do it. Under coverage, when it comes to sample, it means you are really having like a small sample, and you are not covering every gender, you are not covering every nation, and this is what we call it uncoverage. So you need to make sure that the representative sample covering every group, whether small group or minority or majority, you have always to make sure that you have enough of them. It's not 50-50. When we say minority, let us say 10% and majority is 90%, then your sample has to keep the same proportion. It's also will be wrong if you say, okay, I have two nations and I will consider them 50-50 while they are not 50-50, then your sample will be biased. So you need always to keep the ratio that persists in the population, maybe 80-20, or maybe multiple nations. Definitely, this is just an example of two, but you can imagine that you can generalize this idea to multiple nations. Now I'm going to take you through to very important subjects, and you need really to pay attention to it. So it's really very important, which is called reliability and validity of measurements. So reliability and validity measurement became very important concept. They are not really affecting each other, but we have to make sure that reliability and validity are being maintained in our measurement tools. So you need to know the difference. So mostly we want to measure what we call it construct. Construct is very high level. A variable, which is sometimes we call it a concept, which you can't really see it. Like if you want to see someone is satisfied, how do you know that the customer is satisfied? So satisfaction is a construct. Or if you want to say that the performance of student is another construct, economy is another construct, but usually we cannot measure the construct itself. We can only measure indicators. So that's why there are economic indicators. So like inflation rate, unemployment rate, GDP, and more microeconomics and macroeconomics indicators will help any economist or any researcher to understand the economy of nations. But in order to judge or assess the economy, you cannot really say I'm measuring the economy. You can only say I'm measuring economy through indicators. So the economy itself is a concept, economy itself is a construct, but the indicators are the measurement that we are always go for it. So the same for happiness, the same for satisfaction, the same for student performance. All of these are construct, and we have to make sure that when we want to measure the performance of a student, when we want to measure the happiness of a human being, or the satisfaction of a customer, or some other construct like intelligence. So you need really to define the construct first, and then you ask yourself, definitely you can't do that, but I mean, you ask science and how we're going to measure performance of a company, how can we measure performance of a nation, how can we measure performance of a student, how can we measure happiness, and so on. So we don't need really to brainstorm how can we do that, because scientific work will help us how to measure happiness, how to measure these kind of things. So in economy, you will definitely have these indicators that helps us a lot to really know how to measure the economies through measuring this indicator. Anyways, whether we are getting some indicator from somewhere or we want really to develop our own, we need to make sure that we, as a researcher or as professionals, is to make sure that the survey that we are using is reliable and valid. So reliability, it means refers to the consistency of the measure. So we want to make sure that every time we use our survey and apply it on a certain sample, and if we change the sample, we still get similar result, or respondent, they understand the questions in the same way, or the meaning of the rating or score is the same, perceived also the same way among all respondents. So this is very important, and there are methods to how to test this reliability. One of them is called test and retest. We're going to talk about it. It's over time. We're going to talk about it very shortly. Internal consistency among different items, and as well as the interrogator or the people who are observing the phenomena under study, like observing the economy or observing the happy people or satisfied people. And we give them our survey to see if our survey is really bringing similar result, in order not to really to change or to have a not or unreliable instrument. When it comes to validity, it means the extent to which the scores from a measure represent the variable they are intended to. Again, if you say, okay, if I want to make sure that I'm measuring happiness, so yeah, maybe I cannot really ask the participant, are you happy or not? You can always ask that, but this is not the way we do it. We only try to find some indicators if the person is happy or not. So if we observe people in classroom, and if we look at their faces, if they are smiling, if they are saying jokes or telling jokes, or they are in a high spirit, you can see that, then you might really say, okay, this person is really happy. So the question is, have observing smile on face is enough? Is it enough to measure happiness, or we need more? So this is why validity became very essential here. So there are 4 types of validity: face validity, content validity, and criterion validity, and finally discriminant validity. So let me take you through different in the next couple of slides to show you what does it mean, every points we cover here. So test and retest, that means if you have a construct and you already develop a couple of questions to measure happiness in this case, or performance of students, or maybe customer satisfaction, you use your questions that you plan to give it to respondent to answer, and you measure today, and maybe next week you come up again. So in a time 2, so this is time 2, it means week 2, and time 1 it's week 1, and then you measure the same construct. So you can see in this picture we have the same construct being measured twice over a certain time. If the construct brings us the same result, then we might say that yes, this is a proof that the instrument or the survey or the question that we are using to measure it, it looks like reliable and consistent. So there are multiple ways here, and it's kind of measuring the correlation between the result and the score you get from construct 1, and you calculate the correlation against the result coming from construct 1 at time 2. Okay. So another way is called internal consistency. You can see here, even the construct consists of 6 items. Sometimes we call them items, sometimes we call them indicators, sometimes we call them variables, but in the end they are questions in the questionnaire and our survey. So imagine that construct is the performance of the student. Item 1 maybe quiz 1, item 2 quiz 2, and so on up to item 5 is quiz 5, and maybe item 6 is the final exam or midterm exam. The question is, are these 6 items or 6 components are enough to measure the performance of the student? Yeah, hopefully yes. When we design class and we design assessment tools, we need to think as lecturer, the performance of the student is really considered by construct, and we want really to make sure that we are fairly measuring the performance of the student. And it might be more than 6, could be less, it could be 6. It really depends on the course and depends on the nature of the course itself. Anyways, internal consistency, it means that we want to make sure that all items are really measuring the student performance in this particular course. So for instance, if the course is called quantitative management decision making, Then item 1 will be quiz about chapter 1, and item 2 it's a questions about chapter 2, and quiz about chapter 2, and item 3 is a quiz for chapter 3, and so on. So but hopefully the questions inside each quiz is really asking questions related to the topic and not about economics and not about psychology and so on. So that means internal consistency. So this is one of the things. So the last reliability concept is called inter-rater reliability. When you have the same construct being measured, observed by different people, different researcher, different observer, and if they see the same thing, then we can really conclude that, yeah, if they see the same thing using the same instrument, it means really the instrument or the data collection that we already developed, it's very reliable. And this is very good news for us. This will take us to the next topic in this chapter. It's called validity. As I mentioned before, validity is the extent to which the scores from a measure represent the variability or the variable they are intended to. So that means, hopefully, as I mentioned, that all questions that we ask for quiz 1 will ask questions about chapter 1, 2, and 3, but not asking questions in chapter 4 or 5, because this was not the intention for quiz 1, and so on. So phase validity, it's basically, if I go through here, phase validity is kind of trying to make sense of each question in the survey. So if we are measuring happiness and the construct is called happiness or satisfaction, we want to make sure that the item 1, 2, 3, 4, or these 6 questions are really related to satisfaction. For instance, if the construct is customer satisfaction, then item 1 may be asking the respondent, are you going to buy in future? Did you in the last couple of payment, did you complain? Did you place complaint? If nothing happened like that, it means, yeah, it looks like the participant could be happy, or the customer. So, but the question that I just asked now and relate them to the satisfaction, they make sense. I'm not asking, for instance, how's the weather today? And this is not related to customer satisfaction. So if my item 1 is about weather, then it's not phase validity at all. So we need to make sure that the wording of the questions are really related to construct that we are measuring. The second type is called content validity, which in this case, whether or not the 6 items are enough to measure the construct. Maybe they are not covering all of them. Maybe we need to increase them. Maybe the 6 items here represent 6 questions for quiz 1, and maybe I asked 6 questions only for only one part of chapter 1 and 2, but I didn't ask any question about chapter 3. This will not be content validity. So if I want to be fair to you, and I'm saying the quiz 1 will be quiz about chapter 1 to 3, then I have to make sure that all questions are related to all chapters. So I'm not missing any of these chapters. So that's what we call it, content validity, to make sure that my questions are covering all chapters and not are biased. Criteria validity is kind of comparing or benchmarking what we are measuring against what really measured before. So for instance, if you get in quiz 1 high grade, then I say, okay, if in order to make sure that my quiz 1 was really valid, and because you got high grade, it's not because the quiz was easy, but that really reflects your performance. Then I need to watch your performance in another course like economics or accounting, something similar to statistics. Then if I see that you are still scoring high in another courses, and you scored high in my course, then it looks like the quiz was really valid. But if I say that you scored very high in my classes and very low in other courses that have similar nature, then I will doubt that maybe my quiz was not valid at all and it was too easy and something wrong happened in the way I'm asking questions. This is what we call it, criteria validity. Last type of validity we call discriminant validity, and it happens always when you want to measure two different things. Let us take it as an example. I don't know if you can see it, but I don't think it's going to see it here because for some reason I don't know how to move I will try to move my picture from this later on. So, but I have no option now. Anyways, Imagine that we have two constructs. One of them is called self-esteem, the other one may be called motivation. We need to make sure the questions that we ask, these three questions we're asking about self-esteem, are different from the questions that we are using in order to ask for another construct. So that means item 1 will be only dedicated to ask about construct 1 and doesn't really ask anything about construct 2. So it's like distinction between different types here. So this is it for this chapter 3. I hope yeah, I went very quick because there will not be questions, as you see, that I tried really to make it easy for you. Try really to listen to it again if you find it's important for you, but otherwise you can also flip it and go ahead to look at the slides without even listening to my talk. But if you find that you need it, yeah, please do it. Thank you.